Tuesday night edition with Pastor Ralph. We've got a couple of writers with us tonight. Ross, I see that you're muted. If you could unmute yourself, and then there we go. Awesome. Rick Chambers and Ross Landers, they both were featured writers in the Small Town Anthology number 8. And this book is put out by Tournament Writers, Vicksburg Cultural Arts here in Southwest Michigan, just a half hour from me. We'll get to where you guys are from. I'm here in Fulton, as many folks know who watch our show. And last year, I won a couple awards. This year, you guys won, and that's awesome. I'm a little jelly, but it's all good because if we like to read and write, you guys' stuff was great. I read your pieces at the last minute. Sometimes I do that on purpose so that the piece is fresh in my mind. This time it was just because I'm so busy. And wow, really good pieces. I want to go through some questions, but underneath, if some of you, I think if you're watching, folks, if you're used to Zoom and we're doing the slide to Facebook, Ross Landers is at the bottom of the screen. We've got Rick Chambers to my left, up there on the screen. So I'm going to ask him a series of questions, and if we could kind of take turns answering. First of all, Rick, you won for your story, Tuesday's Tie, right?
Correct. Yep. That's the story.
And you won the grand prize.
I did.
For that. Was that a surprise to you?
It was. Like everybody at the contest, I hoped that I might be a grand prize winner, but that wasn't necessarily counting on it. And so it was nice to hear that announcement.
Did you feel that this piece that you had written, whether it been fresh for the contest or maybe something you resurrected and toyed with and maybe worked on to make it better, was a piece that perhaps could more than maybe some of the other submissions you have made?
I did write this for the contest, and it was one of those things that at one point in the process, I kind of gave up on it. I wasn't sure that it was going to be the quality that I really felt I should submit. But then I got serious about it in about the week or so before the deadline, and it felt really good when I submitted it. So I was glad to do that.
You set it on the proverbial back burner, and when you returned, the muse was really working good, right?
Exactly.
The writing process, and we'll talk maybe more about that in a moment. Ross, with your piece, Freedom, wow, great piece. By the way, going back to you, Rick, I just want to commend you for suspending our anticipation, like wanting us to continue to read the piece and see what happens without giving anything away. Folks, you need to get this anthology, buy it, and support the Vicksburg Cultural Arts, but also these two guys who I know have other jobs, I'm sure, and maybe you could share a little bit what you do on this is what you do on the side, but maybe one day you'd like to be writing and getting paid for it. But the proverbial sorry artist thing. But with you, Rick, I just like, man, you knew the tie was going to work in to the change of the way things were happening. And then at the end, again, without saying anything, like, wow, what an ending.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Really did. And it's not easy to write in a short space to resolve the plot, I'm sure. And so maybe you had different endings you were going to do, or before you finally decided on one.
I will tell you that the ending I always had from the very beginning, how I wanted to end it. The challenge was the word count, to your point. At one point I almost double the word count that was allowed for the contest. And so I had to get ruthless with my editing pencil. I think it was a better story as a result. Yeah.
Editing is something I've found to be difficult, but the more I do it, the more I find out, well, how could I have ever put that in? That's so superfluous. It doesn't really add. So Ross, I'm sorry, back to Rick on that, but your piece, I just want to commend you, called Freedom. What a great piece to read after I just watched Top Gun. No, I mean, everybody's yelling about Top Gun. I like the first one, what, 30 years ago? Some of us are too young to maybe have remembered watching it, but wow, what a film. And your pace, the pace of your piece is like you are there watching it, and the details aren't slowing that pace down, but yet they belong too. So kudos, great work with Freedom. And just the different things that are there that endear us to the word itself. And so was this the only piece that you had submitted? Did you submit? I think both of you submitted 2 pieces. Is that correct?
I did 3.
You did 3. Okay.
Just one.
Just one for you. And you won second place for Freedom in the adult fiction division, right, Ross?
Yep.
Okay. So tell us about the genesis of this story being fiction. That was it for the contest itself, or something that maybe you brought back and reworked?
It was mostly for the contest. I knew there was going to be a word count, so I kind of went towards the pulp route where I had to hit it hard and fast and
Okay. Yeah.
clear cut. I don't have it's not very murky or anything. It's very you have a good side and a bad side basically, and you just have to go in there hard and heavy.
So both of you writing these pieces in the fiction genre, is that the genre that you're comfortable with, where most comfortable, as opposed to poetry or nonfiction?
Yeah, and Mike, I'm sorry, Ross, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead first.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, fiction's kind of my place, mostly because during my day job, I'm writing, doing professional writing and decidedly nonfiction. So it's nice to do the fiction stuff on the side. Plus, it goes back to my childhood when I was writing stories, even as like 7, 8 years old, and notebooks and so forth. And that's just something that's carried on for shall we say, a number of years since then. So
that's great. So what do you do in writing nonfiction pieces, or on your regular job, your day job?
Right, yeah. So I own a public relations consulting firm.
Okay.
I've been in business now for a little over 10 years. Prior to that, I was in corporate communications for a small drug company you may have heard of called Pfizer.
Okay.
Before that, I was a journalist. So this is my space to do fiction.
Yeah, that's great. So, and boy, what a difference that is from the journalistic years, I'm sure, when you were a beat reporter and getting the stories out with deadlines that were probably a lot different than the term of writers. So great. Ross, how about you?
I work at Stryker Medical.
Okay.
So also, healthcare area there, right next to Pfizer, actually, right down the street.
Yeah.
Before that, out of high school, I was in the Marine Corps for 5 years, calibration technician.
That's great.
And then went to Western for creative writing. So I do mostly write kind of like schlock, sci-fi, fantasy, but I have been writing nonfiction a little bit more lately.
So trying to learn that genre as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good sometimes to work against your own predilection or your own comfort zone, so that you can learn what that genre, and maybe makes you a better writer in the genre that you are most comfortable with. Because I think there is a different style for that. Rick, what do you have been through the years your books that have inspired you to become a writer that you've enjoyed? Maybe you can name a few authors, or because I think a good writer has to be a well-read person, and the more well-read you are, the better writer you're going to be. And
absolutely. Probably my inspirations are C.S. Lewis. Most people know him from the Narnia books. I actually got intrigued by his space trilogy.
Yeah.
So Out of the Silent Planet, Paralander, which is probably my favorite book of all time, and That Hideous Strength. And like I said, the Narnia books. Arthur C. Clarke is another favorite of mine. A lot of science fiction writers. James Blish is another one. A little bit of Heinlein and so forth. But the real inspiration before I was actually, well, I was simultaneous with being introduced to those kinds of authors was when I was a kid. Was, and you may have noticed the stuff I have in the background
Oh,
here.
yes.
I was a Star Trek fan.
Yeah.
In fact, I watched the show very briefly when it was very first on in the 1960s.
Wow.
It scared the crud out of me, and I didn't watch it again for a few years. But then I became hooked. And to this day, in fact, just this evening, my son was over and we were watching some Star Trek. And just a few years ago, I had the opportunity to actually write episodes for a web-based version of Star Trek. So it's been full circle for me.
Well, that's interesting. How about you, Ross? What have you been your inspirations in your reading?
Well, similar to Rick, I liked Star Trek growing up. Wrath of Khan's probably one of the best movies ever made.
Yeah.
But also Star Wars. But recently I've been watching a lot of old anime shows.
Mhm.
And one of them is called Mobile Suit Gundam. And I think that, for freedom, at least, I took a lot of inspiration from.
Yeah, it would seem so, sure, even from the title itself. So, wow. How about individuals? Let's talk about, like, I know that you had said, Ross, and we'll start with you just as a segue, but you had mentioned that your degree from Western was in creative writing. But can you think of teachers or maybe your parents or friends who inspired you to write, or has it been more of a recent kind of a desire in you?
Well, I did go to Western for creative writing. I wanted to get away from technical manuals and publications and stuff like that, and kind of indulge in my artist side. But would I like really call myself like a writer? I don't think so. I'm able to like force myself to like knock stuff out every once in a while. But I have so many other interests that I don't just like constantly write.
Okay.
But my mom, for one, has always encouraged me to be creative and create things. And then it's actually my boss is who found the tournament of writers and was like, "Hey, why don't you try this out?" So she was also a very big force behind submitting for the tournament.
And so did you share, I know you shared that you were in the Marines. So what do you do now for work, your day job?
Actually, I'm what they call a continuous improvement technician, which is we run the onboarding class. We're part of the continuous improvement team, which is a team that basically goes out onto the production floor and looks for ways to improve the process. But my specific role in that team is onboarding. We bring in contractors and direct hires, and it's a 3-day onboarding process where we go over the culture, the facility, safety, quality, and then we help them with computer training and benefits and stuff like that. And then on Thursdays and Fridays we help with the continuous improvement projects.
I apologize, you had said striker, so but that's interesting to find out what exactly you do with them, and that actually helps because there's a lot of businesses, and not to get off the subject, but where the onboarding process in a new field or company that you get hired is really less than best. And we've all had our experiences where we found out on the job later on, and it would have been better if the onboarding had been. So that's great that and it makes the company better too. So Rick, to you, this question to you, what would have been your inspirations growing up? A teacher, parent, or who kind of spurred you on?
Sure. So I think, I mentioned C.S. Lewis and Star Trek and that sort of thing. Those two things kind of brought together the kind of writing I wanted to do.
Right.
My folks, especially my mom, was a real encourager. In fact, oddly, just last week, I was digging around through an old file and I found a story that I wrote in like 5th or 6th grade. And I distinctly remember getting a good grade on that. And my mom being just effusive in her encouragement of me as a writer. I had no idea that this piece still existed. She'd kept it in a file all these years. And it's been almost a decade since she passed away. So it was nice to have that in hand. But just the teachers that I had in school, in like creative writing classes and so forth, who were just really encouraging. And I'm sure Ross can attest to this as well. What I found was that being a good writer was extremely helpful in getting good grades in school. Because even when I had to do a test, an essay test on a topic I didn't really know as well as I should, I could write my way to a halfway decent grade with just a little bit of knowledge. So I bet Ross, you can attest to that as well.
Oh yeah. I wrote a lot of I took a lot of like medieval studies and like early British literature classes where, yeah, basically write my way through it. I mean, that's the part about being a good writer, right? You're almost like kind of a liar.
Yeah, there's a couple of initials that I could say right now that I can relate to what you're saying too. I remember in one of my English classes in college, doing a last minute assignment, and it was my own fault, but because I knew I could write well, I left that and did maybe some other things, the studies, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I went off and goofed off. I probably did that. And the teacher went on and on about how good that piece was, and I felt about that high because I knew I didn't give it my best. And so it was kind of, so I know what you mean. Yeah, we have that. And so describe the writing process for you personally, Ross, when you sit down to take an idea that's been germinating in your mind creatively that you think might be a good storyline or plot. Freedom, for example, is it laborious? Is it something you said you knock them out? So maybe for you, inspiration comes quickly and it's over and you breathe a sigh of relief. Just maybe because everybody's just different, I'm thinking.
Yeah, it's for me, it's more like it's not necessarily, it doesn't feel like an artistic thing as it feels more of like kind of like I'm just creating a product kind of thing, which doesn't sound very romantic or anything like that, but it's kind of how it is. And I just get it out on, I just force it out on the page, no matter how like unorganized or terrible it is. I just force it onto the page, and then I go back later and look at it. And in Freedom's case, though, I did write it for the contest. I knew there was a word count involved.
Yeah.
I leaned heavily on the pulps of old, like especially like Robert E. Howard, Conan the Barbarian stories, where it's almost like each story is not even like a full thing. It's like a little snippet of that world. And I was like, all right. And, like Rick, I wrote more than I was supposed to, and I had to chop it down. And when I'm editing, I find a whole lot of like redundant sentences or dialogue that's not necessary because I already showed that in the action or something like that. And so basically by cleaning it up to getting in the word count, I got it, better. It became better and cleaned up. And it is pulp. It doesn't really, have like a really deeper meaning or anything like that. It's just hard-hitting action, fast action.
Yeah, but it's good.
And that's what I like to read about. So
cool. And certainly, and I impressed the judges to get second. So Rick, how about you and the process for writing for you first?
It's diverse, I guess is the word that I would use. Sometimes it is a particular idea that I have or a message that I want to deliver that will drive the story that I'm writing. Sometimes it's just, and C.S. Lewis used to talk about this, just an image that pops into my head that may actually have very little to do with what the story's about, but from that image grows whatever the tale ends up being. Yeah. Other times it's, and I think I mentioned this at the reception, all of my stories are tied to my faith at some point or other. And so sometimes there may be a Bible verse or something, or a Bible story that, I want to communicate in, story style, a parable of some sort. So all of those things sometimes come together. And and we go from there. So like in Tuesday's Tie, in the case is, without giving the story away, in case any of your viewers want to read it, I had this notion of what if what tie you wore determined the course of your life.
Yeah.
And then that's from there was where the story grew.
That's awesome. Wow. That's so cool. I can't help but hone on the editing thing again, but it really is a process that in of itself, this monster called editing, where you go back in and like, how could I have put that? And you said it, Ross, with redundancy. But here's another piece too that I sometimes think about with the editing process, especially with fiction. Sometimes there's an editing that is like not taking something out, but putting something in that left the reader like, geez, because we're the anonymous person, we see the whole thing, they don't. And so sometimes our direction with the plot, or what's seen and not seen, we assume that they're seeing it, something we didn't put down on paper. Do you ever come across that where somebody that actually edited your piece might ask that question, whether it's a peer person in a class or one of the judges for last year or even this year, like, here's what you could have done. It's like, oh, how did I miss that? I should have put that in. Did you find that within any editing any of your pieces this year or any of your writing? Where you've had to go back in and, well, we'll ask Ross, you've had to go back in and like, oh, I forgot, let me put that in. Because that's as much part of editing as taking something out, do you think?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I did experience that when I was editing a little detail that I had to go back earlier in the story and write that in, because at the end it has that detail there. And I was like, all right, well, I have to at least like mention that. It shouldn't just come out of nowhere at the end, and I did get, some constructive criticism back from the judges, talking about how they felt that they didn't really, I don't think they liked that it was just a snapshot. They wanted it to be more detail or more character development in there. Personally, I think it's okay without that. I think it's leaving it up to the reader's imagination is okay, at least in the case of this story. But some people want a little bit more detail from the characters.
I would agree with you, and especially since you characterized your writing in that way. And I think we started out me saying that, wow, bang, 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 it's a get up and go. So how would you develop the characterization in a piece like that when you're limited to the word count? Later on, that might come out if you were able to take that piece later and develop a character to where that character may become more endearing to the reader. Certainly, that certainly would help it become even better. So, but yeah, sometimes that happens. How about you, Rick?
Yeah, similar to Ross, one of the bits of feedback I got on Tuesday's Tie was one of the judges saying, I really, really like this story. There's this one character I just wish I got to know a little bit better.
Right.
And I actually accepted that criticism, if we want to call it that, or piece of constructive feedback, very, very well, because I absolutely agreed. And had the word count allowed me a little bit more flexibility, I would have fleshed that character out better. That's one. The other example I think I'd give, and it's an entirely different setting, are the when I was writing for Star Trek New Voyages. And in that case, I had the opportunity to interact with the actors who were playing the roles in the series. Cool. And so, I mean, sometimes they would call me from, Hollywood or wherever they were living, and we would have conversations and opportunities to further develop their character, because they know it's like, look, I know how what my character would say and do in this situation, and I think you're close, but can we, fiddle around it? Or even on the set when we were filming, we did some of that. So I think there's always room to fiddle around with your characters a little bit and make them a little bit more real.
Yeah, and just to the point of constructive criticism, don't you feel that when you get that from a peer or teacher, or in your case, actors across the country, that if you're truly a creative person, you will appreciate that. You will like, you won't be in tears. Oh, I remember in one of my creative classes that I felt so bad for this young lady, but we were in a peer critiquing our pieces, and so she began to hear what folks were saying, and they certainly didn't say it in a way that was slamming or judgmental. And she was so upset. She walked out of the room. I'm like, wow. And I saw her in a Dunkin' Donut later and kind of consoled her. But part of me wanted to say, if you want to write, this is what's part of you wants that. And you're like that. I don't know if you guys ever get this feeling like, oh man, I should have known that. Dang, how did I do that? But then it's all good and you go back and fix it and it gets better. Or maybe you're the kind of person where it just all comes and it's all perfect. I don't think that's true, I'm sure. So, but you just have a hunger to make it better. How many edits, how many drafts, it's like, oh my word. Finally you get to a point where I'm going to leave this for a little while. So, yeah.
But Ralph, you make a really good point. And I think, and Ross, maybe you can relate to this too, is writing, at least for me, writing is a personal thing. It's an expression of something that's deep and abiding within me. And so I, like any writer, be it experienced or neophyte, struggle with criticism. And so you have to take that step back and say, look, as long as it's somebody who knows what they're talking about and someone whose perspective you respect,
right.
You listen to that, and you're perfectly within your rights to say, I appreciate that feedback. I don't agree with it and won't, not planning to incorporate it.
Right.
But as long as we're honestly listening and being critical of our own skills, I think there's value in that.
But before you share it, I want you to share what you think of how it makes you feel too, Ross, as Rick led into that. But I think that sometimes we wince at that, but then we find out what a beauty and a reward it is to kind of get in it and make that better. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I think people, when they do critique and they know what to talk about, they know when they cross the line from objectivity to subjectivity. And maybe this piece that you guys both got, seemed like with the characters, was more of a subjective thing that if you were able to have stretched that out beyond the word count, you would have been able to do, and gladly, and probably wouldn't have even been a piece that would have been a critique. But that line of subjectivity and objectivity gives us that leeway to be able to agree or disagree and say, hey, that one is a little more. So go ahead, Ross. What leaves you feeling?
I love feedback, whether it be painful or complimentary or agree or disagree. It's one of my favorite things about writing. When I was in creative writing, I loved going into class for the writing workshop after they've read one of my stories and just getting destroyed. Sometimes it's really good feedback and you're like, oh, okay, I'm using that. Sometimes the person is just being mean or whatever, and you're like, all right, and sometimes they're trying to give really good feedback, but you feel that it doesn't jive with your story or whatever. But regardless, I loved getting that feedback. I really loved getting it in writing too, so I could hold on to it and collect it.
That's awesome.
So that's one of my favorite parts about the whole process, especially with the tournament of writers. I love opening that envelope and be like, all right, here's the good part, and reading the feedback.
That's good. What areas of growth have you seen in your writing over the years as it's matured? And if you mentioned, Rick, picking up a piece that when you were fifth grade or whatever, but where you say, wow, how did I write that? And look at me now, and you have a good feeling. We'll start with you, Rick.
Yeah, I think where the growth has been in my writing is characterization, and I strive more to make my characters human now than I might have 20 or 30 years ago, and not just cogs in the narrative wheel, as it were. And I think a lot of that growth happened again, both in my first novel, which I wrote back in 2010, and in my work at Star Trek, which really you had to make those characters human. It couldn't be just about fire phasers and that sort of thing, and even making the bad guys, maybe not so, hated, at least to make them a little bit sympathetic. So, so that's where, and I find that's really fun. And I've come to now, when I watch television shows or movies or read books and so forth, I come to really appreciate writers who take that extra step to make their characters more and more human.
That's good. And let me just interject before I turn into to see what you have to say about that, Ross. The three-dimensionality of characters is sometimes a difficult thing to do, but the more three-dimensional you can make them, where they're not, even the bad guys, are you become sympathetic about them. I really appreciate authors that do that, because really life is like that. It's the old song, Stevie Wonder and was it Paul McCartney, Ebony and Ivory. We know they were talking about the skin color, but really it's the whoop and the woof, the good and the bad in all of us that make us more believable. And you can actually begin to see how that person just tick, and like, wow, your heart begins to. There was a show, Monica and Tess, where the characters, like we get an Angels show years ago. And I think they did a good job, the writers, with making the plot and the characters three-dimensional, so that they weren't just people you hated or didn't like in the typical bad guy, good guy kind of thing. So it's difficult, but it's important to do, and maybe it takes time. Go ahead, Ross.
Yeah, I just want to say there's a really good book series called Chronicles of the Black Company, it's like a dark fantasy about a group of mercenaries that don't always fight for the good guys, so to speak. So there's a whole lot of moral ambiguity, and it's one of my favorite series. And one day I hope to write characters like that. Right now, I'm just focusing on sort of the whole showing, not telling, sort of showing things through action rather than just writing, oh, so-and-so felt bad. I'd rather write something like they're weeping or well, I try to cut the INGs. I try to leave it as just hard past tense. So also like form, I'm also trying to work on too. So like he wept, or his stomach churned, instead of saying like he felt bad or he was scared or something like that. That's kind of what I'm focusing on the most. We've
got more tools now than we ever did, don't we? With the internet, Microsoft Word, newer versions of it. I know that at one time I was running a piece in the program had a way of cataloging what percentage of my voice was passive or active. And I'm thinking, wow. And this was a few years ago. This is a good tool. And I was astounded how passive my voice was. And I wanted to work toward making it more active. It's something you said there, Ross, alerted me to that. We can always make it better, can't we? True. What areas would you like to see yourself get better at in terms of writing? And maybe we talk conventions, mechanics, control of plot. Plot was always something scary to me. And that's why I didn't tackle fiction for years, because I thought I already know with nonfiction the story, how it comes out. And I like to write about family growing up in Maine. I always thought I was more like John Boy in the Waltz. He was my inspiration, hiding his writing under the bed, But when somebody told me, if you've got description down, plot, don't be so afraid of plot, because they really are interwoven. What areas do you see yourself getting better at as time goes on? Maybe that relates to what we already asked. Maybe there were some areas that, like me, scared you. I don't know if I'm going to tackle that. I know, Rick, go ahead. You mentioned characterization, but is there another area that maybe?
Yeah, it's funny. One place I think that I have room to improve is subtlety. A lot of my stories have a moral. I tend to write parables. I tend to write morality tales. I can't believe I neglected to mention this. Another one of my inspirations was Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone.
Yes, I can
see. Yeah, there's a lot of that kind of fiction that I write. And sometimes because I'm so, strongly wanting the reader to get the point, that sometimes I hit the reader over the head with it. And I usually am fairly decent at catching that in editing. It's like, well, but I really would rather get better at letting the reader discover on his or her own what the point of the story is, or maybe they end up taking something slightly different away from the story than what I intended. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So subtlety, I'd say is a place I could work.
That's good. How about you, Ross?
I would like to get morals in my story just at all. Like instead of just action for action's sake, I would like to leave the reader with something to ponder for a while after they've actually read the piece.
Yeah, cool. And maybe let's just say it. I mean, you started out talking about Top Gun, but with all the action that happened, I think that was fairly well written, script wise, despite the action piece that it was, and the lack of using CGI and real time flying pilots up there was amazing. But you really did feel with the characters, and they were three-dimensional. They were going through difficulty, and yet they had their redemptive sides. And then my last question, and I know that Rick, you mentioned that you already were published and you had a novel you wrote. How long ago was that?
My first. Yeah, so I actually did a series of 3 novelettes for Open Door series back in the mid 1990s. That was for adult literacy and English as second language. Cool. My first full-blown novel was Radiance, that came out in 2010. And then in the midst of our COVID experience, I decided to consolidate a lot of the short stories I've been writing over the years and self-published a book called Random Precision. And there's about 25 stories in there, all fiction with except for one memoir that's in there.
Okay. So related or sci-fi genre, or
a lot of that same sort of Twilight Zone approach tends to be, oddly enough, and this was purely coincidental, the first story in the book is about a virus that ravages the world. Wow. But I actually wrote that years before we were introduced to the coronavirus. So, yeah, that's just the same kind of thing, except for the memoir was about a personal experience I had that I thought would be of interest to readers.
Well, the Radiance piece, who published that and what was that about, real quick?
Yeah, so that came out in 2010, and it's kind of a different take on the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the search for 10 righteous people. It happens, the story takes place on the moon in the late 21st century. And I don't want to give too much away, but it's all about some mysterious strangers that turn up on this moon colony and start a whole cascade of events that actually would determine the fate of the entire Earth. Wow. So I had fun writing that. It was an enormous amount of work, which is why I've tended to lean in more toward short stories since then.
Get them down, feel good. So is that available, both those pieces?
Yep, you can get that on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's still out there. In fact, I believe there's even a couple of copies at Michigan News in downtown Kalamazoo still on the shelf. So
good. How about you, Ross?
Well, I used to have this image of sort of self-publishing collections of short stories that maybe had sequels and like different volumes and stuff like that you could tie together for a more complete story. As far as novels go, I don't think I'm patient enough to sit down and write a novel. I did get 50 pages into kind of a superhero type of novel that I was writing, which is the most I've ever gotten into like one idea. But I stopped a while ago, and but now I don't know if I want to pick it up and start writing again because
you'll find that day. Yeah,
it's intimidating, you know.
It can be, but I think you've given it time, and maybe you'll pull it up from the back burner, I'm sure. And maybe that suggestion, the critique of fleshing out those characters more could be seen in something longer than. And yeah, so that's cool. I think about and I always end my time with our guests in prayer, if you guys don't mind, just for your lives and your continued effort to write. But I think of my conversation with Paul Young from the book The Shack. We've had him on our show three times. And here's a guy back in the days of Kinko copiers, and he wrote The Shack. It was almost a cathartic book, based on some experiences he'd had as a missionary kid years before. And he'll say that. and he gave it out to his kids as a Christmas gift. And they're like, Dad, you need to publish this. And then, of course, the rest is history. 10 million copies made into a movie, but whoever would have thunk it? And maybe not all of us are going to aspire or get to that level of success. And that's not why we write, because we feel it in us. I think there's a hunger and desire to get something out on page, whether we see it as a product or an expression of our artistic feelings, or the message gets involved somehow. But I pray that God will just bless you guys in your writing journey, and that is you're able to give time to it, because that's the most frustrating thing to me. I've always got so many irons in the fire, and I don't know if you've related in the past or even now. It's like, man, I wish I had more time. And as I'm getting older toward retirement, maybe I'll have that time, but then I'm hoping I have a mind enough, that's sound enough and clear enough to be able to put all those things into words. So God bless you guys. Thank you for being on the show. We might get some more people who are interested. I think this went well. We'll trim this up. It takes overnight for this all to get recorded. And so later in the week, I'll splice it, trim it, and make it look good. I don't think I'll have to trim a whole lot, really. You guys are ready, man. And so I'll send you copies, and you're welcome to. We like to ask people to share our pages on YouTube, because again, this is a win-win. And there are a lot of things that we do on Faith, Family, and Friends. It's all about people having stories, and you guys have your own story about writing stories, which is really cool. So thanks for being on, and we'll close in a word of prayer. Amen.
Thank you. Yeah.
Lord, thank you so much for my new friends, fellow writers in the business and the process of getting out on paper stories, Lord. Two guys who write fiction, something that I want to do better. But Lord, thank you so much for the creative genius, for giving them the gifts that they have. I pray for their lives that, Lord, you just work on behalf of their aspirations and desires and endeavors, Lord, and that you would be with them, any needs that they might have tonight in regards to their home life or their own inner life, or personally. Father, you know what they are, and you are a God who meets those needs. And we thank you so much for our time together tonight. We pray for anybody that's watched this broadcast tonight that maybe has a seed, a desire to write, but maybe they're embarrassed by it, or I don't know how to start, or they'd like to get better with their writing. Somehow, if they've been inspired by these two guys, these two gentlemen's stories, I pray, hey, it was worth it being on the air tonight. Thank you again for our time together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. God bless you guys. And
thank you.
Get in touch for sure. You're welcome.
Thanks for having us, Ralph.
Okay, God bless you.